Hi everyone. Today, drawing. I get a lot of questions about drawing, and I thought I would just strip it all back and talk about it. As always, a caveat, I am not the last word in drawing or anything in terms of making images, but I have my own sort of approach, and I have my own ideas, and I encourage you all to have yours. It's good to listen and pay attention maybe to what others have to say on the subject, but in the end, like in everything, we have to choose the methods and techniques and materials that work best for us. So I'm going to be going through a lot of the materials I use and hopefully clearly explain to you why, but you're welcome to try any of these techniques or materials, of course. I didn't invent any of this. But in the end, I think we all have to gravitate toward the way we want to make images that works best for us. Okay, our subject today is one of my favorite spots on earth, the beautiful Belvedere Castle here in New York City in the middle of Central Park. It's on near one of the transverse streets, just north of 79th. I think it's around 83rd Street, but it's pretty much plunk in the middle of the park. It was built in 1865-ish, 67, I think, by, as part of the master plan, Frederick Law Olmsted's master plan of the park was to build a sort of a folly, they called it, sort of not a habitable building, but an architectural, ornamental building, really, and just used as a meeting place and an overlook to the park, etc. The actual architects of the structure were Calvert Vaux, who worked a lot with Olmsted, building a lot of the structures in the park, bridges, etc. And also a Jacob Mold, if I have his name right, who designed the building using materials found in the land, natural granite and a schist, a kind of almost a flint-related hard rock. Very beautiful and characteristic stones found in the park, and they built this beautiful folly in sort of Romanesque and Gothic style, but to look almost as if it's growing out of this outcropping of rock. I could talk on and on about Central Park, but I won't. Today's topic is drawing. But this is the subject. This is a photo. I have several here that I took just a few days ago. We had I don't want to call it a freak snowstorm, but it was unusual. It hasn't snowed very much here in a very long time. And one day I woke up last week and it was just everything blanketed in white. I canceled everything I had to do and I ran to the park, and it was snowing quite hard, so I couldn't paint or draw, but I took a lot of photos, and obviously I'm going to be drawing today from the photos and some sketches. So as always in a work, I try to figure out what is my intent, what is the feeling I want this drawing I'm going to do today to have. That helps me establish the mood I'm trying to convey. The experience I had is always what I try to put down on paper, not the actual look of something so much, not actual technical accuracy, more on that later, but really more the experience, the emotional impact. It was snowing very hard, very overcast, obviously. So the sense of light, as you can see here, was very subdued and subtle. I thought just heartbreakingly beautiful. And I want to try to get some of that idea across. As most of you know who follow me at all, I work all of my paintings and drawings up by considering three basic values to help establish a sense of depth. a darkest dark, a lightest light, and then a range of midtones. Because there's no direct sun and it was snowing very hard, I mean, obviously I could reinvent and make a blue sky, but I really don't want to. I want the intent of this work to be clearly the experience I had on that day, which was happily trudging through the park in a snowstorm. So I want to convey that limited, narrow sense of value range. My darkest darks will be here in the outcroppings of rocks and in the structure itself. And you can see in this photo that, I mean, again, I could change this, reinvent it completely, but again, I want to keep the value range narrow to tell a quieter, more subtle story than a drawing that had very wide expanses of value. A bright sunny day, you'd have brilliant whites and saturated darks, but for this, I want to keep it narrower. My lightest lights will be the bits of snow here, but even those aren't entirely pure white, though I may make them that way. The sky was just this, I thought, beautiful, steady, steely color. The midtones range from lighter midtone in the sky, darker midtones to the background buildings and trees, and then the darkest dark, again, will be the structure and some of the outcropping. I approach drawing very, very much like I do paintings. I think of them as designing in shapes of tones and values. Yeah, drawing is more line-based just by design, but the way I love to draw is I use tone and shading, and I think about it more in terms of shapes of value rather than descriptions of things. So my reliance on line work is less than my reliance upon shapes of tone and value, which you'll see when I get going. So that's my intention for this drawing, and it describes a bit about my design for the composition. I had two sort of main photographs here. Both are kind of nice. One obviously displays a vertical format and one a horizontal. I think I want to make this a more ground-based, somewhat more intimate view, and in that way, I think a horizontal format, the traditional landscape format, will play nicely into that intention. I did a watercolor of this some months ago that was more in this format, and it was a bright sunny day, so I could really emphasize the sky. Here I want the sky to be there, obviously, but more of a supporting cast member, so less focal in the final work. What I want to do is a nice drawing, a finished drawing, rather than just a quick sketch. I love drawing. I go nowhere without a sketchbook, and to me, sketching is the very best way to get your impressions down quickly of the world, of your inspirations, of what you're feeling, what you're thinking, what you're experiencing, what's going on in your life. For me, it's just because perhaps that's what I'm used to. I don't want to sound like drawing is the only way to record your impressions, experiences of the world, but I think it is one of the most fail-safe and successful ways there is for visually oriented people such as you and me. So I do love drawing. I talk a lot about drawing. I think people worry too much about drawing and think they're not good at it, so they tend not to practice it as much as they should. My feeling is you don't have to be that good at drawing to practice drawing sketches in your work as a way to quickly record your feelings and impressions of the world you live in. You don't have to draw beautifully or perfectly. You don't have to have a master's degree in architecture. You really don't. I mean, I am an architect and obviously went to school and grad school for architecture, but yeah, we did study drawing in school, but even in those prehistoric days, early stage computer graphics were coming online, and most of my classmates were not as interested in drawing and hand-done artwork as was I. So I just gravitated toward it because even as a kid, that's what I did. I loved to draw. Whenever I was sad, I wanted to draw. Whenever I was happy, I wanted to draw. It was a way I had to give a sense of order, I think, to the world around me, and the way I had to non-verbally express myself. So what I'm doing is just carving in, really, the basic shapes of the structure. And I want to talk a bit about what materials I'm using and what I will be using. As a surface, I'm drawing on very textured Baohong watercolor paper, rough surface. This is one of my preferred surfaces for painting in watercolor, but I also love to draw on it too. It's very textured, and obviously when you start to lay in shadows, shades, you'll get that sort of speckled effect, very highly textured. May not be for everybody, and it certainly isn't for every drawing or painting, but I think for what I'm trying to do today, it will be effective if I don't screw it up too badly. And by that, I mean it was snowing and visibility was limited. There was a sort of grainy, textured feel to the actual atmosphere that I was walking through. And so I think this more textured paper will be a good choice for helping me convey that experience of low visibility, and maybe, if I'm lucky, even sort of hint at the falling snow. So that's the paper. Pencils I'm using will be a range. Mostly the tone work will go on with these, my very favorite sketch pencils. Black by Blackwing, the Palomino, Pearl, it's slightly harder, and the 602 is sort of a medium weight by Blackwing. It can go quite dark or not. They're not numbered like typical graphite 4B, 2B, etc. But I would gauge overall, this is probably about a B, and this would probably come in at around 2B or so. They make harder ones still. I have this sketch pencil that I travel a lot with, the Faber-Castell E-Motion pencil. It's just a nice, hefty mechanical pencil that you can drop in leads of different weights. And this is about an HB lead. I may be using this, I'm not sure. When I travel, I usually only, not always, but sometimes I just have this, and that's all. I think you can see I'm using one of these. This is just a habitual pencil, mechanical pencil by Caran, sort of an old-fashioned architect's pencil. Again, mechanical pencil meaning you can swap out leads. I have an H lead, so not as soft. It's a little bit harder, but it's very useful for making somewhat more precise lines. Again, the overall look I want for this when it's finished is a little bit tighter than just a quick, loose sight sketch, but a little bit looser than well, a great deal looser than a technical drawing or an architectural rendering. I do not want that. I want this to be all freehand and have some fluidity and looseness to it. But again, not be quite as loosey-goosey as a fully plein air sketch might be. So I'll be swapping, toggling back and forth between all these different leads and pencils. All of them will be listed in the description when I post the video. So drawing on watercolor paper, I love it just because you can use the texture of the paper to your advantage. And it's just another sort of, it's almost a medium that's given to you that you can use. It's not, again, it's not always right, and it's not for everybody, and it's not for every work, but I tend to love the effect that you can get. So again, I'm just carving in the main shapes of the structure and now some of the rock outcroppings. Just as in watercolor, I'm going to try to save the white, the lightest bits of the painting by not drawing them. I'm often asked in interviews, etc., how do you paint light? And the truth is, well, you don't. Not in watercolor. You paint shades and shadows that reveal the light. And that's exactly my approach to drawing. You don't draw the light. You draw everything except the light in order to reveal it. Working from photographs, it's, in my classes, I really urge people to keep it to a minimum. Obviously, I don't think it's the end of the world or a bad thing to do, but I think there are built-in problems when you work from a photograph. The tendency, if you don't stop and catch yourself every moment, is to copy what you're looking at, to think that whatever happens to be in the photograph is correct, and anything you draw or paint that doesn't look just like that is somehow wrong or bad. And that isn't true. Not always. I think the photographs can be helpful, but they're just a starting point. Do not be afraid to redesign, reshape, reform, plant a tree, take out a tree, change the light. In my former career as an architectural designer and illustrator, I was generally pretty obsessed by design and by request from my clients to be very careful and very accurate about the identities of buildings, of course, that they were proposing to be built. But that's very different than this kind of drawing. This is more about feeling, expression. It's not the potential success of your painting or drawing is rarely going to rely on absolute physical accuracy of everything you put in it. Very few people, although some exist, but very few people are going to, well, none probably, are going to just see your reference material and judge you from it. Only you know that. If you're drawing a fairly well-known building like this, yes, there will likely be people that were going to tell you, oh, you missed a window, or you didn't get this right, or that right. Well, you know, again, I'm not going to tell you or anyone what's right or wrong. It just depends on what your priorities are. If absolute technical accuracy is your priority, that's fine. but in my case, it's generally not. Again, trying to convey the experience of the place, to me, is far more critical than trying to depict absolute technical precision at all times. My favorite works are always about contrast. Light versus dark, of course, in watercolor, complementary tones, warms versus cools, energies, horizontal versus vertical, etc. My way into art, my way into making images, is the whole idea of contrast. Two opposite things meeting on the surface of the paper, sort of fighting for dominance and finding, hopefully, some kind of a resolution. So, along that spectrum, if there are elements of your work that are fairly detailed, fairly technically accurate, they can contrast really pretty nicely, intentionally so, with other areas that are more loose, more suggestive, and impressionistic or sketchy. It's something I've worked on for a long time. Slowly, I think I'm getting better at it, but the whole idea of having a little bit of detail in a finished painting, for example, can be just enough. Viewers are smart. They can look at your work. The human eye can fill in the blanks. You don't have to always spell everything out for everybody. Perspective. I'm looking pretty frontally at this. It's hard to tell in the photograph because the light is so subdued and muddled, but this really is a two-point perspective, meaning these planes, the lines would recede way off the page that way, and then turning the corner on each of these shapes, here, 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 and here, these lines would recede off the paper over here. I'm not setting up perspective points. I am just, I think the technical term is winging it. I think close enough will be just fine in this case. I don't feel any need to do technical construction of exactly where vanishing points are. I want this to look free-handed, experiential, a little bit more expressive. And to that end, sometimes a little bit of wonkiness or inaccuracy can honestly be kind of a good thing. Don't be afraid of it. Oh, erasers. I use these white vinyl erasers by Mono, or Tombow is the company name. But any soft white vinyl eraser will work well. These are some of the softest I've ever been able to find. I think they're still accessible. I bought, I think, 10 boxes of them years ago, so I would never run out. Helps if you never make any mistakes, but I do. The reason soft vinyl eraser is important. Art gum can work, but I find it gets very gritty and dirty. It picks up a lot of dirt from my drawing area, so I tend not to use it. But a softer eraser, whatever you choose, is the way to go because it'll not scratch the surface of your paper. In a drawing, it isn't going to matter quite as much as it would in a watercolor. You can have sort of literally invisible scratches that will not show up until you layer paint on them, and then it's too late to do much about them at that point. So there's a little body of water in front of this, which you can barely see in this photo. You can just see a little strip of it. So I'm going to do a little reinvention there and take out the foreground altogether, I think. Everything I'm drawing is in the midground and background. I'm putting no foreground in this. My hope by doing this drawing in this way was that it will further enhance this experience of well, almost solitude in a good way and quietness by having nothing really dark or looming in the foreground, but rather to have all the information a little bit distant so that when this is done and if it's successful, the viewer's eye will sort of jump over this undefined foreground and just land nicely in the midground area. It's a traditionalist way, really, of drawing. It's a little bit more what I always like to say is presentational, meaning it shows the viewer your experience rather than hitting them over the head with it. So yeah, it's just another little tool that you have as the artist to help orchestrate where you want the viewer's eye to go. So yeah, I'm doing some reinvention here and try to keep all the stuff I'm drawing, I'm just sort of making up as I go. Hopefully it will look of one piece and purposeful and not anything wonky. So I will do sort of a subtle reflection down into the water of what happens up above. I don't want to be too specific about it, but just some sense of it. I meant to bring it up, but perhaps you noticed the first line I drew in this was the horizon line. And the horizon line is the line of sight. Whoever you are that's doing the painting or drawing, wherever you're sitting or standing, and you look straight ahead, that's going to establish your horizon line. And it isn't the end, the visual end where everything stops, of course. There's visual information above and below the horizon line. This isn't technically a lesson in perspective, but it does come into play, so I always like to point that out. So I'm going to do something I literally never do in watercolor, or almost never do. I'm going to do a little bit of masking. I'm going to try something here. I want to lay a light flat tone onto some of the sky beyond. Some of the lightest lights I want to preserve are just along the very top ledge of this castle ramparts and the snow-covered roofs. Some of that I can pick out later with an eraser, and I will, but I'm going to just try to maintain a bit of a straight line here. I won't worry too much about that. I think I can pick that out with an eraser later. Again, this is all going to be darker than the sky, so I don't think I need to worry too much about that. I think that's it. I'm not going to mask that little one out. I think I can erase it out and reclaim the light. So again, I want to lay in a soft tone in some of the sky. sort of lighter at the top, slightly darker as it reaches down. Yes, I am going to include some of these buildings sort of ghosted in the background, but a little less graphic than you see them in the photograph. I want to really make them vanish up into the stormy, snowy sky. So I'm a little hesitant to draw them at all because I want them to really just look like ghosted shapes. So there's some of these beautiful towers along Central Park West. This is, I want to say the El Dorado. I hope I have that right. If I don't, I apologize. Okay. Here is a way to lay in a graphite sky. This is a very old school pencil pointer that I use with this mechanical pencil. What I'm going to do is take the top off, pour out a little bit of ground up graphite on a piece of scrap paper. Then with a paper towel, I'm going to see how I'm going to pick up a little bit of that graphite on the paper towel and then try to just gently blend it into the paper. I could go over the towers because they're all going to be a little bit darker when I'm finished. This technique works much better on much smoother paper because it tends to just flatten out much more quickly. So I'm just rubbing it with the paper towel. I put it on initially in sort of an angle because when I draw and add tones, my hand goes in this direction, as you'll see. So I'm hoping that if any of this directionality stays, it will look attached and all of a piece, and it won't look out of place. So I don't mind some of these directional lines, but I just want to soften them as much as I can. I put very little graphite, just the tiniest bit. I think this is going to be good. You might be thinking it looks messy. I don't think it will, though. There'll be some background trees that will blend in nicely here. Obviously, the main structure and these ghosted towers on the back and trees again on this side. So all is well. The eraser will come in handy to pick up anything that looks too strident. When this drawing is completed, I will spray it with a fixative, sort of a spray-on adhesive that will help it keep from smudging. So I'm just doing all I can to sort of eliminate any angled lines in the sky. Again, I don't mind some, but really the whole intent of this drawing is that it look soft, quiet, and undisturbed. So I'd like the sky to be sort of as flat and undynamic as possible. I think that's good. Just like in a watercolor, I work my drawings up from light to dark. The lightest lights, of course, are the surface of the paper. It's already done. So I start in with my lightest midtones, and then I begin adding darker midtones, and my darkest darks most always happen near the end of the whole process. So, one of the risks of drawing is smudging. If you don't want your drawing to smudge, you have to be careful where you put your hand while you're working away. If you're clever enough and you're right-handed and can work consistently left to right, of course, that will help eliminate any smudges, but I tend not to be able to do that because I jump around and I work on a little on this area, a little on that area. So just take a piece of scrap paper, I'm just using one of these reference photos, lay it down, rest your hand on it, and that'll really do just about all you need to do to keep you from smudging it. Now here, again, what I'm doing is reestablishing these towers in the background. I just really want them ghosted. I don't want to draw too much. So I'm still using this mechanical pencil because it has the hardest lead, an H lead. It's not really hard, but I can get a softer line with it than I can this. The softer leaded pencils will make a darker mark than this. Usually when I draw or add tones, I like to go in one direction as opposed to sort of cross-hatching. Since I'm drawing with my right hand, I move my arm, my elbow, and my wrist from upper right to lower left. So I try to get a consistency and directionality of my pencil marks. It doesn't have to be absolute for me, but I think if overall that's what I do, the finished drawing is just going to look more cohesive and has just a nicer overall finish. So I'm being very gestural about these background towers. I'm trying to make them really look like they're just melting a bit into the snowstorm, which they really were. But again, the photograph made them look pretty clear, and it wasn't that many days ago. I remember being there. They were not very clear. They were very ghosty. You could barely see them. So I'm trying to draw more of that experience than whatever shows up in the photo. I think that's enough. Because they're so ghosty, I may use a paper towel to even blend away some of the pencil marks that I put there and to melt it into the sky just a little more. So this tower has a little bit of saved white on the tops of the roofs. I didn't mask those off, as you can see, so an easy way to sort of reclaim those is you can do some sort of on-the-fly masking. 2 pieces of paper, you can make a bit of an edge. So this distant tower, I want it in the composition, obviously, but I don't want it as dominant as I want this darker, older tower. This was a newer pavilion structure. Quite like it, but just compositionally, I think if I make it too dark or too dominant, I'll get sort of a funny bookended look. So I'm doing my best to make it a little more suggestive overall. Now I've swapped out to using the Blackwing pearl white, so it has a darker mark overall. It's tough. So much of what I draw and paint tends to be very lucid and clear with a very dramatic, often a very dramatic value range, meaning from really, really dark to really, really bright. And it's a little tougher for me to do this in which the value range is so intentionally narrow. I love it, but I'm just monitoring myself to not get too dark or too clear on anything, but to keep it nice and suggestive. I think we can dispense with this little masked bit now. So yeah, there you can see the snow-covered roof that I preserved. This is an open-air trellised tower, so it isn't solid stone as the rest of the assembly is. So it's a little lighter in reality, and I want it a little lighter in feeling and a little lighter in value. I love these pencils. I used to not travel with them because they're relatively soft, you have to sharpen them quite a bit. But I finally just got a portable sharpener so I can take these when I'm teaching or traveling. They're just too nice to draw with. Again, this is an open-air pavilion, so you can see through it a bit. It's a little bit more transparent and airier and lighter. And in this overcast day, it really looked, I don't want to say it looked insubstantial, that's not true, but it just looked more ephemeral than the black granite that was that forms the base and the original ancient tower. So I don't have a particularly fixed idea in mind about how much detail here and there I want to show. as I said just a moment ago, I want a little less over here than I will here, but it's not really that fixed in my mind exactly what that means until I start to do it, and then I kind of decide on the fly if it's enough or if it needs more. Now this is beginning to form the old stone base from the 1800s, but also this dark base will begin to define some of the light that I want to preserve on this beautiful curvilinear ledge. So as this comes down, the stone base of everything I'm making a bit definitely darker and a little bit more clear and obvious. I'm going to want the whole painting weighted on this side. So, as I said in the first place, dominantly this will be a horizontal. The horizon goes through the painting just about a third of the way up from the bottom, and then the secondary energy will be this, the dominant vertical will be a little less than a third, but occupying that third of the painting versus that. So it is a pretty traditional rule of thirds structural composition, and we'll see how well I get on. So this rock goes down and vanishes into the forest on either side. I'm a little unclear at this point how much emphasis I want to give it, but I'm thinking less. So I'll just allow this to trail off at this point. I'm going to keep working up here along the dark granite base of this structure. There's an intermediate belt line here at the top of the parapet, so a little bit of snow gathered there, so just a little sparkle of saved light will be nice. I don't have to be too rigid about it, but just the idea of it, just a nod to it would be cool. Here I'm just gathering up, I'm obscuring some of the detail and just gathering up some of those values, bringing them down and connecting them. Again, it's a way of drawing that's more shapes and value based than object or line based, and I love it. I think I've got enough done now that you can see how the texture of the paper is starting to inform the eventual final work quite a lot, because I'm using a fair amount of pressure as I draw this way. Not a great deal of pressure, but a fair amount. And it's still, you know, it doesn't give a solid coverage, which is what I want. I don't want a solid coverage. I want little speckles of the paper to show through. And because of the texture of the paper, it allows me to get that effect, which I think gives a little luminosity, definitely to a watercolor, but also to a drawing. And I hope, as I said, almost implies the snow in the atmosphere and the reduced visibility of the day. Foolishly, I'm working from right to left across. It's okay. If I'm careful, it'll be all right. Although I might swap and start in on the tower and then connect the two in the center. I am doing some of the darkest darks now, so what I said about laying in the midtones before the darkest darks, I'm not exactly holding true to that, but I think it'll all work. I want to get these major shapes established, and I think that's going to also help me determine how much of the background material, if any, I really want or need to put in. For this dominant vertical tower, I'm going to swap up to a Blackwing 602, so slightly darker than the pearl, the white pencil I was just using. I mean, it's really quite similar, but it's a little softer, so it makes a slightly darker mark. And I want this tower, as I said, to be the more dominant vertical element and to act as an anchor to this whole composition when I'm done. My guidelines under have all been obliterated by my scrubbing away at the skies, so I'm really just winging in where this tower should go. It is great with drawing, though. It's fairly forgiving. You can manipulate it and obviously go back and erase something if it's completely out of whack. Sometime, I don't know if I have the dates right, but I think in the early 1900s, this became a weather station for Central Park and maybe parts of the city too, if I have that right, because it was one of the highest points in this part of town and unobstructed. It no longer is. Now it's a visitor center. And the Central Park Conservancy is, well, they're brilliant. They've done such a great job in bringing the park back to where it used to be. Many of the famed sites, the carousel, the bridges, walking paths, but in response to a more modern age, they've really updated facilities, overall security and safety, added bike lanes that didn't exist, of course, long ago. I love New York City, but I just cannot imagine this place without Central Park. It is like the lungs of the city almost. It breathes. Central Park is massive. People ask me how huge it is. I really didn't know. A little while ago, though, I researched it. 845 acres, I believe. So it's quite huge, and there are forests and lakes and ponds and streams and wild, completely natural parts of it. It isn't all manicured. So there's all kinds of ecosystems. It is a destination and a stopping point for migrating birds, and lots of birds live there. People who love birds are all over the park all the time. So there are windows here and this larger structural bits. I'm trying to give a nod to them without giving them too much love. I just want to suggest that they're there. And in the back of my head, I'm just thinking about how dark I want the darkest parts of this drawing to be. This will be one of the darkest. And yeah, I think that's probably as dark as I want to go. If I'm honest, I'm worried I went a little too dark on that tower. But we'll see. As I go further, all will be made clear. Perhaps not. So I'll lay in a little tone sometimes going this way, but it's more general. I'm putting no pressure on the paper, on the pencil. I'm just dragging it across the surface. Then I'll connect it all with my more characteristic diagonal lines, where I use a little bit more pressure. So that if any of these lines are visible, hopefully they will be those diagonal ones. Yeah, there's a good deal of, well, not a good deal, but there's some detail that I sketched in moments ago, and it's all gone now. These larger windows. I just want to leave little glints of lighter and darker suggestions that there are these windows there. I don't want to make too much out of them. I don't want to be too literal or too illustrative about this. Again, I'm trying very hard not to do an illustration, but more of a drawing about an experience. So lack of detail, lack of visibility is really key. I suppose the overall intent is I'd like this castle to almost look like it's emerging out of this mist of the snowstorm. Slightly visible, but almost like a mirage or something. And another reason I didn't include any foreground, I'm trying to emphasize the overall mystical mirage-like feeling of this. Anyway, so far so good. Just hints at these windows I think are plenty, and I think that's good. As an art student and architecture student, I would travel around and I can just remember endless hours sitting in piazzas in Rome or in churches or in the Vatican or all over France and Germany and maniacally drawing everything I saw, trying my best. I just had this assumption, erroneous I think now, but good practice at the time, that if I could draw something absolutely accurately, it would be better. and I know I've said this earlier, but it really depends on what you want. It is not necessarily better to be technically perfect or precise. Sometimes that technical precision, or even the desire for it, can get in the way of doing a better, more expressive, personal piece of art. But there's not a right answer to that. If it's a question, there's no right answer. It just depends on what you want, what your intention is. I suppose for me, I spent so many years trying to be technically precise and perfect and so-called accurate that for years I missed out on all the expressive possibilities that art offers, not realizing. So now at this point in my life, I have great respect for technical accuracy, but I just happen to know that for me, it isn't always a sign of a better piece of work. It can be, but it usually, for me, isn't. There's a little, much smaller pavilion up here. So I'll just give this guy a little bit of love. As I'm drawing, I saw some of these lighter bits emerging just naturally, organically, and I rather like them. I think this whole shape does tie together pretty well as a large dark shape without having to make it solid dark gray or black. So I'm going to allow some of that luminosity to remain as a good thing. Now I'm going to break out one of these tools from my early days of architectural drafting called an eraser shield. This is just a quick way to mask. But if you lay this down with this exposed open line at the top of the parapet here, you can reclaim some of that bright white to look like a little bit of snow. I will list this in the materials. I've had this thing for 100 years. I presume they're still available. I just don't know anybody that still does mechanical drawing or drafting, but I'm going to assume they're still available, but I will research it and find out if they are, where you might get such a thing. For drawing, it's very handy. Yeah, and you can drop in there and pick out some lines. I suppose the equivalent would be scrubbing a little area in watercolor would get you the same effect. This little tiny pavilion roof is quite white, not such a big deal, but there you go, little guy. So, not done, of course, but most of my darker darks are at least established. Now what I want to do is ratchet back and go back into my midtones and lay in some of these distant trees and to the left and right. But I think, well, I needed to see how light or dark they needed to be by establishing some of that dark tonality. So I don't have to draw any of these just because they show up on the photo, but if they're useful to me, if they help make the drawing better, I will. And I think in some cases they are. Here, for example, some hint of these distant trees will help pop out the top of this snow-covered roof. Some of the trees in the park here in the midground, they don't need any detail or any clarity. I just want to use them as a mid-tone shape to join in these towers beyond. And here and there to help pop out the snow on the top of the darker parapet. I think that's really all that's needed. I don't want to make them too aggressive, and I don't want too hard an edge, so I'll blend them in a little. Right. Okay, over here, same thing, but I'm going to do a little reinvention. So hardly any value at all. I'm using that H lead to just lay in a little bit of ghosty value. Here only to connect and also to help pop out the lights of the it's not in the foreground, but the snow-covered roofs that are in front. All right. Everything's okay, but I think I can tell that if this is the lightest light, this is mid-tone. My darks here, at least at the top of this wall, need to be a bit darker to pull them forward a bit more successfully. So I'm going to lay in a little bit more of that dark value. I'll go back to the 602. Don't want to lose that snow that I carefully reclaimed, so the whole thing doesn't need to be darker, but I think just this leading edge wants to be not terribly crisp, but a little bit more defined than much of the rest. If I do this well, I think it will help emphasize this mirage feeling I'm going for, and it does. I worried this was too dark, but now I see it isn't. It's fine. Because I'm using that same value to pull it in around the tops of this parapet wall. Lovely. Now what I want to do is just imply some of these darker shapes of granite that will mimic the tonality, the value, and the textural feel of the actual structure. This sort of psychologically connect the building to the landscape. A very Frank Lloyd Wright idea, but definitely not Frank Lloyd Wright. Here again, I don't need to be photographically accurate about all of these shapes, but just experientially true to them. Sounds very pretentious, but no, I don't mean it to be. It's just true. I just need to show the spirit of what's there rather than the literal, rather than a literal portrait of what's there. I just have to try to my best to show the spirit of what's there. If I copied the photograph, I'd be sitting here for hours, and it just isn't necessary. I want this to be a nice drawing. However, I want it to have a freshness and a little bit of looseness to connect it more to the world of sketches. Here I have to be careful not to rub my hand over it and smudge and lose anything, but you know, so far so good. Some of this I'm just making up as I go, to be honest. I invented this whole side of the mountain, so I have to invent the rocks that go on it as well. If there's any real clarity in this drawing, I think I would like it to happen around the top of this snow-covered rocky ledge as it contrasts with the building above. So it's a little hazier above, a little hazier below, but just this thread of slight clarity through the middle, which I'd like to say I realized before I started drawing. I don't know that I did. I think I had a general idea, but it became more obvious that's what I should be doing as I continued. So here I'm being a little bit more line-based and careful to get some clarity in these snow-covered ridges. And then again, as it comes down to where the water will be, I can be a little more sketchy and loose about it. Less dark too. Most of the darker values will happen here up to there. I love these pencils, but you do have to sharpen them all the time. So I love this kind of spider web that happens where there's snow and rocks going in different directions, but then but then hopefully gracefully it begins to diminish and the whole thing just begins to cascade down the hill in a less specific, less clear way. If you look at the reference photo, there are, banks of trees over here. Obviously the drawing needs something, but I'm not thrilled with what I'm looking at, so I think I'm going to do some redesign. May as well do that here while I'm here. I'll go to the slightly softer white pearl. And I'm going to try to drop in the idea of some banks of wintry trees forward of those really ghosty ones I did beyond. And then instead of this one larger tree, which I find a little disturbing, I'm going to imply some pine trees, conifer trees, a little bit lower than this one so they don't dominate too much. There are some there, but I'm just building on that idea and adding some additional ones. They're important to frame out the drawing, but compositionally they're not that critical, so I just don't want to make too big of a deal of them or go too dark. And as they come down, they can merge with the rest of the park trees. Also, as we're getting off the side of the drawing in general, I just become less specific. I say this in watercolor paintings, but I think it's true generally for everything I do. Wherever the darkest dark of your work of art meets the lightest light, that's where the viewer's eye is going to go. That's going to be the center of focus. In this case, I don't want it to be a spot. I want it to be more of a line or an area. So really, this should be the center of focus. To get the energy of the viewer's eye to read horizontally across, to make my decision, to make a horizontal composition, all makes sense. It all plays together fluidly, I hope, with that decision. So anything that happens out here, we're getting beyond the center of focus, really, at least for this drawing, so I can afford to be less specific, more sketchy, less contrast, less detail. Yeah, I rather like that. I'm wondering if you don't want anything to come down on top of these rocks, but I think I need a little bit more sense of this slightly nearer trees and forests just here in the midground. Ah, New York. Maybe you can hear, I think my neighbor is renovating something upstairs. I spent the last year and a half renovating this place, so, I have to be a little forgiving. It's okay, I just don't want it to become too intricate or too focal. I may toggle some values there, and then I think take a piece of paper towel and just soften the whole edge of everything. so it just becomes a value and a tone and not an object or a thing to look at. It's all right. I think this this cliff edge needs a little more clarity. It is not accurate. I made this up because it doesn't really show in any of the photos, so I'm just winging it, which is fine. It just means I have to do something that looks good in the drawing. It's pretty good. I'll leave it for now. I'm gonna work my way across, adding in more shapes of the rocks as they come down into the water. Some of these are relatively accurate and some I'm completely winging. I'm simplifying a lot what's really there because I just don't want it to be that busy. And again, if I can just get the idea of it across, the feeling or experience of it, I think that's what's key, rather than trying to be too literal about it all. What really happens here is there's just patches of snow and then some rocks that appear in between. Again, I'm not trying to be literal, but I like that effect, and I think it'll contrast nicely with these more etched bits of rock, so I will imply some of that feeling too here. The snow was so beautiful. Oh, I lived in New York. I was born in Ohio and lived in New York most of my life until about 12 years ago. I moved to Los Angeles to try to reinvent myself as an artist after I stopped my architectural career, and I loved it there, but I never stopped missing New York. My family is all out here. Most of the people I really care about. And yeah, people complain bitterly about the winter, but I don't know. I know I'm privileged because I don't have to drive in it or commute anywhere, so that makes it a lot more tolerable. And if I did, my attitude might be a little different, but I think I can say that this was pretty much a perfect snowstorm in that it snowed really heavily, big wet snow for a few hours, 3 hours perhaps, and then it stopped. And then within the next few hours, it was all gone. So yes, there were no giant puddles of slush, and it was kind of an ideal snowstorm, at least from my privileged perspective as a guy who just sits and draws and paints. The trees on this side of the image, a little bit more important. I want them to read a little bit more forward of those and to marry up a little bit compositionally with the tower. In the photograph, there's this one beautiful big pine tree. It's almost as tall as the tower. That would be a mistake. So I think rather than one, I will do something similar as I did on that side, except a little bit more assertively, and do sort of an assembly of pine trees. But I don't want to match the height of the tower. It would look very awkward. So I'll keep these a little bit lower and have the tower the tallest element. I'll put one on the distant, almost going off the frame over here. Again, I'm not trying to do tree portraits or be utterly accurate about what types of pine trees these are, or it doesn't matter too much for this drawing. It's just they're vehicles, shapes for carrying value and tone. Another kind of drawing, it would matter a great deal. But for me, in this one, they don't too much. They are supporting cast members. So I guess I'm designing a little pine tree forest here. Wasn't necessarily my intention, but I think it'll work. Good thing about drawing pine trees is you can leave little bits of air, light and dark through, and it just helps add variety and luminosity. As I come down into the landscape, I'm going to just add some tones indiscriminately so that they'll fall away into the landscape. And in this case, I have to decide. They really do come down over these foreground rocks, so would they have to? No, but I don't think I want that much white or snow running right off the page, so I think I'll be a little vague about it, but I do think I'll bring them down over the rocks in the foreground here a little bit. See if that was a mistake. I don't think so, but the reason it would be a mistake is if I made too much out of them and became too literal about them. But great thing about pencil drawing is you can smudge things and make things look as nebulous and ephemeral as you like. What I'm really going for is this melding of the landscape, the natural world with the man-made world. So with enough mystery to be interesting, but not too much to be frustrating. I think it's kind of happening. So I'll just try to be happy about that. Yeah, the edges of this drawing are critical just to flesh out the composition here and here, but I don't want too much detail to detract. Here, somehow I drug my fat hand through that and messed up my saved white, but it's fine. The eraser will salvage everything. In general terms, I'm pretty happy with this. I think it needs a little bit more work, but I'm going to let it sit, come back and assess it in a minute. The area of water is not visible. I'm inventing it primarily. So I don't think you want a giant mass of white just bleeding off the page. So what I'm going to try to do is feather this information down into the water, much like I might do if I were doing a watercolor painting, and have not a sharp line where the land stops and the water starts. I want it to be visible, but not overly obvious. So yeah, I want it to bleed into the water a little bit. I think it's happening. This little rock outcropping, I think, wants to have a little bit more, a louder voice. So I'm going to make it a little bit more focal to try to pull it slightly forward of everything beyond and reflect it a little bit more obviously. The towers reading down into the water would just subtly reflect. I don't want to make a big deal out of it, but they'd be there nonetheless. And again, I'm not doing this to be accurate or literal, but really to try to establish connections, which I think are, in some ways, everything in our work. I jury a lot of shows and I judge a lot of paintings, my own that is. And I think where they most often go wrong is in a couple of areas. One, not having a very clearly defined range of values. When the work looks monotone and one-dimensional, it can often fail. But a lack of connectivity, where it looks like the artist just sort of painted by number, a little bit here, a little bit there. Everything has a very clearly defined edge, and your drawings or your paintings look almost like they're cut out of construction paper and glued onto the paper. Oh, I'm so frustrated when I see myself doing that. So I try very hard to make sure that everything both looks, but more important, feels connected. So these reflections, again, are not meant to be scientifically accurate or technical. I mean, they're not even there because you don't see the water this much. But it's to set up a visual and hopefully an emotional connection between the atmosphere, the man-made, and the natural worlds. It just helps you to tell a much more compelling story if you think about connecting all parts of your painting so they look cohesive and intentional. So what I'm going to do now, if I can find it, is go back to that murky little graphite mess I made to do the sky, and I'm going to do something similar in the water, but a little less so. But this, in this case, I'm going to go purposefully horizontal, so hopefully it looks a little bit more like water. I want to work up a lighter mid-tone at the base of the drawing, similar to the sky, but then maintain this thread of light just up against the actual rocks and the buildings above. Hopefully this neutrality of the foreground will help the viewer's eyes sort of jump over into the work itself and really push this whole assembly of elements back into the painting to become part of the midground. So again, there's no real foreground exactly. I mean, the water, I suppose, is the foreground, but I don't want any details in it. Drawing as in watercolor, I think where I've often gone wrong when I paint or draw bodies of water is I have a tendency to do too much. I add too many lines, too many marks. If you really want your, whatever you're doing, your drawing or your painting, to look soft, quiet, contemplative, poetic, if you want to use that big of a word, almost always less is going to be more. So if you draw a body of water that has loads of marks and lines in it, that can be fine, it can work, but usually that's going to imply a body of water that's very active, either waves or wind blowing across it. But if you want it to look quieter, more subtle, then you want it to look flat. So one edge should be darker than the other, either lighter against the foreground, darker in the lighter against the background of the water, darker against the foreground in this case, or flip it, lighter in the foreground, darker. What that helps do is psychologically make the plane of water look flat and horizontal rather than a vertical decorated page. And then use no or a very, very minimal amount of ripples, lines, or rivulets, marks in the water. I could probably get by with none at all, but I do want just a few. Again, when I look back at some of my older work, yikes, I have a lot of criticisms about it. And by older, I mean things I did last week. But one of the main things, to be serious, I notice is that I make what I think is the error of just putting too many things in, too many colors, too many shapes, too many lines, too much. Edit, edit, edit. For the last 5 years or so, I think that's been my motto, to just edit. Stop before you think you should. Include less marks rather than more. He says as he draws more marks. But what I'm trying to do here is just subtly, I hope, emphasize this vertical dominance and the horizontal dominance and the secondary vertical axis is what I'm trying to say. So the tower reflected into the water, I think, is a good thing. but I want to draw just enough so that that effect happens just subtly. It was a very, very cold day, obviously. It was, and the water wasn't frozen over, but I kind of want it to look as if it almost was. And obviously, a sheet of ice is going to look much less rippled than a body of active water, so I want to sort of approach that feeling. Okay, everyone, I think that's about it. I will tinker with this. I think this area needs a little bit more refinement, and so does that. It looks fine. The values look okay to me, but I think it probably needs a little bit more refinement, but I don't want to add more detail than is necessary. So I think I need to think about it for a few minutes so I don't overcook it. Generally, I'm fairly happy overall. The feeling is there, the experience of that snowy, cold day in Central Park works to me. So technically there are a few tweaks I can make, but overall, the narrower sense of values, the darkest dark, the lightest light, and the midtones all sort of work in a narrower value range to tell the story. And yeah, it looks like a cold, snowy day at Belvedere Castle in Central Park. Thank you everyone for joining me, and I will see you all again soon. Happy painting and happy drawing.